Thank you for coming to today's program on the crisis in Israel. I'm Andrea Grossman, the founder of Writer's Block, now in our 27th season. Thank you. That's my cue, right? Today's program is one that I felt was necessary as I'd read the news day after day, not able to differentiate my anger from my frustration or my sorrow from my discomfort about the situation in Israel. And when I'd read David Myers and Daniel Sokach, their op-ed pieces in the LA Times, I'd find some relief, although less optimism about the relevance of American Jews vis-a-vis Israel. So let's start with Daniel Sokach. As the author of the terrific book, Can We Talk About Israel?, Daniel gives us a primer for the Israel-Palestine situation, one of the most complicated conflicts on earth. At last, a way to understand the Israel-Palestinian conflict and controversy from all points of view. It was published barely 2.5 years ago, and the answer to his question, can we talk about Israel, needs to be a resounding yes. But based on the angry letters I received for putting on today's program, the noise is still pretty loud. And for the past several months, since the installation of Israel's new extreme government, Can We Talk About Israel has become a fraught subject for many American Jews. Daniel Sokach is listed in the Daily Forward 50 as one of the most influential Jewish thinkers and activists in the country. So I'm very proud to have him sitting up here today. But that doesn't mean I'm not proud of David Myers, who holds a chair in history. And I forgot to put in the name of the chair. I have it as XXX. Fill in later, and I forgot. His academic credentials are innumerable, and you'd be numb and asleep by the time I'd finish with them. He's terrific. He is the co-author, along with his wife and fellow brilliant scholar, Nomi Stolzenberg, of the book American Shtetl, The Making of Kiryas Joel, a Hasidic village in upstate New York. Read it, and it'll piss you off, I promise. It is a riveting examination of a town run by and for the Satmar sect, showcasing political and economic power in a huge conflict of church and state, if you'll allow for that. So here's what's going to happen today. We are going to talk about Israel because we have to. David and Daniel will chat, as they have done for 20 straight years, according to them. And then we can ask questions. There are mics right here on either side in the aisle. And their books are on sale in the lobby. Can We Talk About Israel is so terrific, and American Shtetl is great. They're entirely different books, so they serve entirely different moods. And I would suggest that they're great for anybody interested in the big question of Jewish community here and in Israel. So this is David Myers, and this is Daniel Sokach.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Before we begin, I just want to say thank you to you for the extraordinary achievement of Writer's Block, which for 27 years has enriched Los Angeles in impossible ways. It's just really, I remember coming to an event early on in the tenure of Writer's Block and just feeling so enlivened and invigorated by the intellectual stimulation that it brings. And really, it owes entirely to you and your unique energy. So thank you so much. You go, yeah, we'll see you later. So good afternoon, everybody. Really delight to be with you. What Daniel and I thought we would do is really just have a conversation about Israel, which, as Andrea said, we've been doing for at least 2 decades. We did it very intensively over the last 5 years because I served as president of the board of the organization for which Daniel is the CEO, the New Israel Fund. And we had not just occasion, but really the obligation, the responsibility to speak to each other on a daily basis, many times a day sometimes, about the ever-evolving situation in Israel. So we thought we would just sort of continue the conversation and then open up for questions and discussion. But maybe it would make most sense if we just begin by trying to get a sense of where we're at. So, Daniel, where do you think we're at today?
Well, first of all, thanks everybody for being here, and I second all of your wonderful words about writer's block. I see some old friends in the room, and I still miss. I've lived in San Francisco now for 15 years, where New Israel Fund was founded, and I still miss being here in LA. And it always seems to me that writer's block is one of the things that creates community in such a giant metropolis as this one, which is sometimes so hard to do, and it's really nice to be back. So it's lovely to be with you all. So where are we today? Where we are today, I'm gonna answer that question in a sort of micro way, and then we can expand out. Where we are today is we are, I think, 3 days after what I'm going to argue is the third or fourth massive blow, and maybe ultimately the dispositive one, the fatal one, to Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition attempt to radically overhaul the judiciary in Israel. Now, you may think that's an optimistic thing to say, but I want to, and we'll talk about this, I want to parse what I mean. The plan that that the coalition launched, and by the way, on the one hand, the plan that the coalition launched that resulted in hundreds of thousands of Israelis filling the streets in protest was clear. It was written in the coalition agreement. In Israel, all governments are coalition governments, and the parties, there has never been a government in the history of the state that one party has run. It's always been a coalition. And the way it works is that the parties make essentially agreements, like quasi-contractual agreements with each other about what the government is going to do. If I join your coalition, this is what I want. And we make an agreement and we write it down. So the plans for what many Israeli media folks have called the judicial coup, right, or revolution, which the government calls the reform, they were there for anyone to see. It's just that nobody really thought it would be the first thing that happened. But of course, it was the first thing that happened, and you mostly, I think everyone here probably knows, again, it resulted in this massive backlash that quite clearly the government and Netanyahu did not anticipate or expect. I said that we're 3 days out from the latest big blow to that agenda. And that was the downgrading of Israel's rating by Moody's. Right. So the first thing that happened, and this happened in the ancient days of a month and a half or 2 months ago, right? Around the time, David and I went to Israel, and were there for some of those protests. And when I spoke with the U.S. ambassador to Israel, during that visit, he said, "Look, the thing that they're clearly freaked out about," he said, the government, is the financial ramifications of this thing. The shekel was dropping, and tech leaders had just come out and said, "Look, we can't stand behind this. If you want Israel to continue being startup nation, this high-tech center, then you can't have a situation where there's no check and balance in the system. No one's going to invest big dollars into Turkey or Hungary or Russia or Poland because there's no political stability, and that's the attraction of Israel." And the tech people started protesting, and so the ambassador said he did not expect that tech and finance would sort of react as they did. The next so the first big blow were the hundreds of thousands of people. Then the tech and high tech and finance joined the protests or signaled their displeasure. Then the reservists or the revolt of the reservists, right? Elite army reservists who suddenly started declaring that they would not show up for reserve duty if the judicial reforms were passed. And what they said was, there were two main messages there. The first one was, look, you ask us to do often terrible things, difficult things, and we do them because we believe that we're doing them at the bequest of a democratically elected government that stands for principles that the state stands for. And if you don't stand for that, if you're just a dictatorship or an autocracy, then we're not going to do those things. And the second reason they said, look, people always talk about dragging Israeli officials into the international criminal courts, right? And in The Hague and applying universal jurisdiction so that an Israeli officer could be dragged into a court in Madrid or Ontario, right? The bulwark against that happening has been an independent judiciary. That's why they don't do that. If you do this, then we're all vulnerable. So the reservists made their comments. Bibi freaked out, pressed pause after he fired the defense minister for saying essentially what I just said. He walked that back, and now he's reinstated him. And then finally, the other day, Moody's downgraded Israel's credit rating. I never claim to know what's going to happen next in Israel. I don't have a crystal ball, but I think it will be exceedingly difficult for Netanyahu to bring back the judicial coup agenda at this time. And I'll stop there, except to say that, as we both know, that's not the only agenda item on this government's priority list.
Maybe take one step back and return to November 1st, 2022, and try and make sense of what happened there. Daniel has just told us what's happened since that time, but what happened there? That's when a new government coalition took form that had 64 mandates and 120-person Knesset. So by not only by Israeli political terms, but especially by the terms of recent Knesset elections, when indeterminacy was the rule, 64 votes as opposed to 59 or 60 or 61 for a coalition seemed like an extraordinary majority. And in thinking of how that came about, I'd point to really the convergence of maybe 3 or 4 factors. The first is the coalition that Netanyahu was compelled to put together. And it seems at one level to be a luxurious coalition, but it's a very awkward assemblage of parties. It includes traditional ultra-Orthodox parties, 2 ultra-Orthodox parties, the Sephardi and Ashkenazi party, 2 far-right national religious parties, and the Likud party, in which Benjamin Netanyahu stands on the far left of the sector. And
just think about that.
Yeah, think about that. This is how they got to 64, through this very, very uncomfortable assembly of forces, with the 2 right-wing political parties, Otzma Yehudit and Tzionut Datit, religious Zionism and Jewish power, as the catalysts. They both are helmed by people who I think there's no other way to describe as far-right extremists, who have long records of racist, anti-Arab, homophobic statements and indeed actions. That is Itzhak Smotrich of religious Zionism and Itamar Ben-Gvir. Both of whom, in this very awkward assemblage of political parties, were given very important cabinet positions. Smotrich as finance minister, and as a minister in the defense ministry responsible for essentially Jewish affairs in the West Bank, and Ben-Gvir as the minister of national security. So what might have prompted Netanyahu to turn to these people? Because it was clear at a certain point that he could no longer turn to others to the left of him, centrist parties like those headed by Yair Lapid, Yair Shatid, or blue-white Benny Gantz. And he was...
Now it's national consensus.
Now, which has become the national consensus. He was compelled to do so as a matter of political survival, and that's the second factor that helps explain the moment of November 1st. The first was this unusual coalition of forces that were intent on overcoming the state of paralysis that Israel had been in after 5 previous elections that yielded either a very slim majority or no majority at all, kind of Italianate form of parliamentary governance. Netanyahu needed the coalition in order to survive. He's on trial, accused of corruption and bribery, and he calculates the best way to stay in power is to be prime minister when there is some ambivalence on the part of the judiciary toward moving ahead with a political trial, which is one reason why it's been delayed so long. There also have been various proposals that Netanyahu and his allies have put forward that would grant immunity to the prime minister from any possible prosecution while in office. So this is a matter of absolute political survival for a person who already is the longest serving prime minister on record. So we see the convergence of those two vectors, this sort of new sharp rightward drift in parliamentary politics that really reflects important developments on the ground in Israel, which has itself moved significantly to the right, especially amongst younger generations. Sort of in defiance of every known rule of political behavior, Israeli kids are more right-wing than their parents. So this coalition is a function of that. Netanyahu's need to survive. And I'd say two other factors. One is the concerted activity of an extraordinarily effective think tank by the name of the Kohelet Policy Forum, funded by American Jewish donors, which has the agenda of basically fashioning Israel, not as a Jewish and democratic state, but really as an ethno-nationalist Jewish state. And one of the key principles in the Kohelet manifesto is to strip the judiciary of its power, based on the belief that the judiciary is in fact an unelected group of elitists that has taken power away from the vox populi, the voice of the people, and needs to be. Kohelet has been astonishingly effective in advancing legislative proposals that have been passed, and many of the proposals that were part of that package that we label the judicial coup. The fourth factor that helps us understand that moment of November 1st, 2022, I think, for me, and this is something we talked about a lot, is the general ambiance of illiberal populism that really has engulfed much of the world over the last 5 years or so. Certainly we had our own very powerful moment of this with the election of Donald Trump in 2016, with some interesting variants, because one of the cardinal tenets of illiberal populism is a form of democracy that we could call majoritarianism, which is majority rules absolutely over the interests of minorities and even individuals. The curiosity of the American variant of that is that Donald Trump never won a majority. But it's been an extraordinarily potent force, especially in places like Hungary and Poland. And it's no surprise that Benjamin Netanyahu sees Viktor Orban of Hungary as perhaps his chief political ally and friend and source of inspiration. All of this adds up to an astonishing new era of anti-democratic political expression and practice.
I want to just add two points to that excellent sort of summary of how we got to where we are. And the first one is you mentioned that the difference here is that Trump never had a majority. And while that's true, it's not untrue, right, to judiciously employ the double negative when it comes to Israel, because there the vagary, our electoral system is obviously the reason why of what is it, of the last however many 9 elections the Democrats have won 7 of the popular, 8 of the popular votes, but still Republicans get elected president. Israel has a version of that. Their own version of that problematic sort of political math is the parliamentary system, the party system, whereby small parties can both be kingmakers, right? If you get, as I said before, there's never been a government that has not relied on coalition partners to form, so they can be kingmakers, but they can also not pass the threshold, 3.2% of the vote that you need to get to enter the parliament. If you don't pass that threshold, then all of the votes for your party are flushed down the political toilet bowl. There's no vote sharing, vote swapping arrangement as there are in some parliamentary democracies. And in fact, in the election all the way back a year and a half ago or so, that resulted in Netanyahu being ousted for until now. what happened was some of the small right-wing parties did not pass the threshold, and they sank beneath the threshold, and their votes were lost, leaving the center. There was that, I call it the Frankenstein's monster, right, coalition, because it was sort of made up of pieces: right-wing parties that hated Bibi, centrist parties, left-wing parties, and Arab political parties, all of whom shared certain agendas, common among them: no more Bibi, rock low Bibi, just not Netanyahu. And Netanyahu won this time because of his adroit manipulation of that math. He cajoled three small ultra right-wing parties, the two David mentioned, and a third, a tiny party called Noam. And you can't make this up. Their platform was homophobia. No joke. The leader of the party had a phone conversation leaked a few months ago in which he identified, I'm very proud to say, the New Israel Fund as one of the greatest threats to Israel. Why? He said, because we're trying to turn everyone gay. Now, I can assure you that we have failed at that tall order, not that it was ever on our agenda. So this is the kind of character and quality of the people that Netanyahu corralled into a single party, which then broke up and went back to its original factions right after they'd achieved the election. But in both of those elections, the difference between the coalition that was able to form and the opposition was minuscule. It's tiny, like American style tens of thousands of votes, not hundreds of thousands. So I just want to say that it's very different math, but there is a sense in which Israel, like America, is divided on a political knife's edge. It's not like an overwhelmingly right-wing country, that's a similarity. And the second point I wanted to make is that the constellation of parties that David just described, they have something in common, and there's a third group in the coalition, right? There's the Likud folks, Benjamin Netanyahu and his Likud. There's the let's call them, what did you call them? The ethno-nationalists, which are they are leaders of the settlement movement, the people who want us to expand, annex the West Bank, the settlement enterprise in the West Bank. Smotrich and Ben Gvir are longtime leaders of that movement. Ben Gvir convicted for terrorism. Smotrich also convicted for a terrorism-related offense in their history in this movement. But there's a third faction, and the third faction are the ultra-Orthodox, about whom you and Nomi write in the American context in the book. And the Haredim, as they're known in Israel, and the ethno-nationalists and the hardline Likud had some things in common. And one of the things that they had in common was a desire to actualize the Kohelet Forum's idea of gutting the judiciary. And the reason they wanted to do this is because, as David said, Netanyahu and the Likud have a problem because Netanyahu has been indicted 3 times and is facing trials right now, and he cannot go to jail. And remember, I know we're all thinking of the American analog here, right? But in Israel, both a former prime minister and a former president have gone to jail for offenses. So, we should be critical. We can be critical of Israel as we are of our own country. But Israel has held its leaders, its justice system has held its leaders accountable and put them in jail. And that's the reason why Netanyahu needs a weakened court. The reason the ethno-nationalists need a weakened court is because every time the court does anything to restrain or slow down legislation or policy that expands the settlement enterprise, that moves towards annexation, or that enshrines racism, that is an offense to them. And they have to get rid of the Supreme Court. It's a unicameral House of Parliament. There's no written constitution in Israel. That's the one check and balance against government overreach is the judiciary. And then, of course, the Haredim have their own reasons for not wanting the court to have the power it has. It was the court who ruled, in 2020, that ultra-Orthodox young men did have to serve in some capacity in the IDF. It's the court that blocks some of the demands that the ultra-Orthodox make of coalition governments. So they all three shared this agenda to gut the power of the court in order to accomplish what they wanted to do.
Yeah. I want to put on the table and then defer for a minute the question of what brought so many Israelis out into the street, because that's really a question. And I want to sort of problematize that question by doing what I guess I do best, which is situate things in a broader historical context. Because I think the problem is deeper than we have just described.
And here I want to think of maybe three contextual circles in which to situate the current moment. The first is the moment that began in 2009 when Bibi Netanyahu re-entered the prime minister's office. He had been elected, you may remember, in the wake of the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, in an election that he was, by all accounts, destined to lose against Shimon Peres, but happened to win for reasons that remain deeply problematic. So he served from 1996 to 1999, and then he re-entered office in 2009. A year later, Viktor Orban re-entered office, and both of them kind of became transformed in their second tenures as prime minister. Netanyahu came with, I would say, a very concerted agenda to really transform Israel. And we see that in his actions throughout the 2010s. So many of the anti-democratic acts that were announced after November 122 already were set in motion in the 2010s. Restrictions, attempts to restrict human rights organizations, attempts to restrict free speech, attempts to restrict the Muslim call to prayer, all belonged to a certain agenda and vision of Israel that was actually formally enshrined in a basic law of the Knesset, which has constitutional status in 2018, known as the nation state law.
And who wrote that?
Yeah, which was the product of the Kohelet Forum's hard work over the course of decades. In some sense, really an almost enviable completion of an assignment over the course of decades to conceive of an idea, to translate it into a popular language, to lobby on behalf of it, and then to see it enshrined. And what it said is Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people, and Jews have, for all intents and purposes, an exclusive right to settle it. No mention of Arabs. There is one mention of Arabic, which is in some sense downgraded from its status as a co-official language to that of a special status. And I would suggest this is the constitutional enshrinement of the principle of majoritarian democracy. That set of developments that began when Netanyahu re-entered office, I think can be seen as part of a large pendulous swing in Israeli politics that extends back to 1992, when the Knesset passed another basic law called Basic Law on Human Dignity and Liberty, which for the first time really gave voice to Israel as a Jewish and democratic state.
David, maybe just explain the basic law system. Like, what is a basic law?
So Israel has no constitution. It has no constitution because it was believed at the time in 1948 that it would be impossible to get the various parties together to agree on a single constitutional frame. And over the course of time, beginning in the 1950s, the Knesset passed laws that were determined to have a particularly elevated status known as basic laws that would assume the stature of constitutional amendment or provisions. For example, I believe it was in 1958 that the Knesset passed a basic law on the Knesset, which actually defined what this parliamentary body was. So the architect or author of the 1992 law was, in fact, a Supreme Court justice by the name of Aharon Barak, who sought to introduce what he called a constitutional revolution into Israel, using the instrumentalities of the legislative branch. Now, this is important for a couple of reasons. One, it introduced the language of Jewish and democratic into Israeli law. And two, it got a lot of people on the right and some on the left very angry that a Supreme Court justice was sort of involving himself so actively in this way. What is important to note, and this is the third contextual web in which I'd like to place this current moment, is really one that concerns the language of democracy. So democracy is introduced into law in 1992 in the basic law I just mentioned, as well as in another basic law. But democracy, the word, doesn't appear in Israel's Declaration of Independence, which is the principal foundational document. There was a debate amongst the founding fathers of the state of Israel about whether there should be an inclusion of this word. And David Ben-Gurion, the towering leader of the Labor Zionist Party and Israel's first prime minister, decided against it for reasons we perhaps can discuss. But there is reference in the 13th paragraph of Israel's Declaration of Independence of the commitment of the state to equality, of rights for all citizens, and to the principles of cherut, tzedek, v'shalom, of liberty, justice, and peace. But there's no mention of democracy. And I would suggest, and Daniel and I have talked about this many times, that Israel has a democracy problem. That the current moment actually begins not in 2022 and not even in 2009 when Netanyahu takes over, and not even in 1992, but really extends back to 1948. There turns out there's not a robust discourse of democracy in Zionist thought. It can be found in some places, and they're very interesting, those places where it's found. But there's no foundational commitment to the ideal of democracy articulated as such. What there is a commitment to is, on one hand, this idea of equality for all citizens and the Jewish right to the land of Israel. And I would suggest that we have sort of the birth of the problem in that document. The tension between the aspirations of Israel to be the homeland of the Jewish people, on one hand, and to be a site of equitable, egalitarian politics is really born there. And it's significant to note that the idea of democracy is actually not given articulate form. So it's a long-standing problem.
David, it's a great point. And, like so many things in the discussion when it comes to Israel, people use phrases with no real understanding of the historical roots of the phrase and the context. And they also don't agree when they're arguing or debating about what those things mean. So, for example, Zionism is one word like that. But democracy is fascinating, and so is another example is Jewish state, right? The New York Times will still describe Israel as the Jewish state. What does a Jewish state mean? And that question wasn't answered, right? We only have that tension in the founding document. I have a question that I've never asked you. Do you think there was? So we know that Ben-Gurion decided against including democracy. Do you think that there was a presumption or an assumption of a democratic system that was at play here?
I do. I think democracy was imported in unarticulated ways as a result of sort of a confluence of forces, factors, and influences that included sort of elements of the British mandatory regime that were included, especially those that had been built up within the Shuv, within the Jewish community, traditional Jewish communal norms, some of which were actually radically democratic, and some importation of continental theoretical values that bespoke the norms of democracy. So this mélange, rather than a single articulated vision of democracy, made for democratic institutions in practice, not in principle, in practice.
Right. And we know it's the 1950s. There's a landmark case at the Supreme Court where essentially the court establishes, for example, and they use this term because the justice who wrote the opinion was born in the Bronx, I believe, a First Amendment style jurisprudence, right? So Israel sort of imports the notion that freedom of expression, part of the First Amendment, certainly not the part that deals with separation of religion and state. But so there is even this notion that freedom of expression and freedom of speech in Israel are both protected and understood in a kind of First Amendment way. So that adds another thing to that.
Right. So I don't want to lend the impression that I think Israel is devoid of all democratic principles or practices or norms. I think there are a lot of democratic norms and values that undergird the institutions of state. What there isn't is an articulated commitment to the ideal of democracy. And I think part of the problem we're in today at this point of democratic crisis is that we have nothing to go back to rely on. No large body of case law, as it were, in the political rather than legal sense, that can amplify what the values are that need to be upheld.
I want to introduce a pill into the cheder, an elephant into the room, because one of the engines of this tension and the idea of Israelis not being able to agree on what democracy is or should be is what you just described so brilliantly to us, right? The founding of the state comes without those labels. It's sort of some things are assumed, some things are thrown in there, and you get a mix that more or less works for a long time until it doesn't, or at least until it's radically challenged as it's been right now. But there's another problem that we haven't really yet mentioned, and that is, here's a little fun exercise for us to play, right? So a democracy is a political system within certain borders, right? Like, in order to say, like, American democracy is a certain system that the Constitution lays out, and it's confined to the borders of the United States of America. What are the borders of the state of Israel? Right? To whom does that democracy apply? And so I want to introduce this notion that another huge challenge to the evolution of an agreed upon definition of what democracy in Israel is the fact that for 56 years, and it'll be in June, right? Israel has controlled the West Bank and the millions and millions of non-Jews, of Palestinians living there. And at the same time, it has moved into the West Bank and into the areas surrounding East Jerusalem, upward of around 750,000 Jewish Israeli citizens in communities that we call settlements. But when you go, all but a few of them, these are not Wild West outposts for the most part. Some are, but they're cities and towns. So how do you have a democracy when you don't have an eastern border, right? It's not just that you don't know exactly what the the ingredients of that democracy are in Israel. It's that you don't even know where it applies.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as you know very well, because you formulated it as such in the book, which I really invite you all to purchase, read, and derive great benefit from. You can have a democracy, but you can't have a democracy under those conditions and a Jewish state. And my own view on this, as someone who was raised as a kind of very passionate Zionist in a very strongly Israel-oriented family, and went for the first time at age 11. My own view is that the erasure of the Green Line, that is to say, the line that separates Israel from the West Bank, has been completed and is irreversible, which means that Israel will ultimately, well, for the intermediate term, end up being a Jewish state or a democratic state, but not both. And I guess I would say that some version of that problem inheres in the declaration itself. Though I think sort of this, and here I do want to integrate into our conversations the status of Israeli citizens who are not Jewish, but Arab. And what would be sort of the greatest form of equality and liberty that they could hope to achieve in a Jewish state. Famously, as we know, an Israeli Arab parliamentarian by the name of Ahmad Tibi has said that Israel is a democracy for Jews and Jewish for Arabs. That's absolutely the case. Arab citizens of Israel do not have full access to every part of the Israeli public square. Would it be possible to imagine that they could, shorn of the problem of the occupation? Perhaps. It seems to me a much less complicated problem to take on, but it is now complicated by what seems to be an irreversible process. And that leads me to say what we're in desperate need of now is a new bout of political imagination, because the existence of the Green Line is the essential precondition to the two-state solution, to the idea that you could have a state of Israel alongside a state of Palestine, which was that extraordinary vision of the 1990s and the Oslo peace process. If we're no longer able to imagine that, and if we assume that a single state between the Jordan and the Mediterranean is not desired by a large number of the majority of the inhabitants of that land, where does that leave us? It leaves us in desperate need of political imagination. And we can play that out a little bit more, but.
Yeah, and I think it's worth stating, right, that, I mean, sometimes we make assumptions, but the Arab citizenry, the percentage of Israel's population who are Arabs is around 20%. So African Americans constitute about 12 to 13% of this country, right? So that gives you a powerful sense of the size relative to the rest of the population of Arab citizens of Israel. And I want to sort of bring us back to where we are now. One of the things that that many of us have noted, and those of you paying attention have noted it too, is that the character of the mass demonstrations, which, by the way, were not only in Tel Aviv, right? They were in Jerusalem, they were in Haifa, in the tens of thousands, but they were also in sort of Likud strongholds like Beersheba and right, and a settlement, Efrat. So they really spread around the country, and it was quite remarkable. There were all kinds of Israeli Jews at those demonstrations, but there wasn't a huge turnout of Israeli Arabs. And there was something that was sort of interesting and painful, I think, for many of us to witness. David and I had a conversation with some of our colleagues on the board of the New Israel Fund, right? And we have Jewish Israeli and Arab Israeli members of the board. And at one point, one of the Arab Israeli members of the board, she and her husband have an unbelievably successful high-tech firm. They live in Nazareth. They are, in any way you turn it, they're sort of poster children, right? Any previous Likud government, not the current one, would see them as poster children for what we all want to see in Israel. Incredibly successful Arab citizens who've got this great high-tech company. And she said a couple of things that really impacted all of us who were on this Zoom call. She said first that one of the reasons that Arab citizens were not flocking to the demonstrations is because they were receiving the signal that they weren't really wanted there, or rather they might be wanted there, but only on the terms of the Jewish public. Or not wanted there. When the demonstrations began, Israeli Jews who walked the demonstrations holding in one hand an Israeli flag and in one hand a Palestinian flag were told, "Don't bring the Palestinian flag." Speakers on the main stage of the protests are told, "Don't mention the occupation." Now these are tactical things, right? They want to bring as many people in, and they're understandable tactical moves in many respects. But they do have the result of some Arab citizens feeling, I'm not really wanted there. Maybe even I'm afraid to go there. And so I'd love for you to sort of reflect for a minute on what's the way forward, right? Let's say, as I think there's a strong chance, right, that the legislation that was so threatening will be watered down or even shelved because of the response within Israel, around the world, Moody's, the Biden administration. Where does that leave that 20% of the population?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And before I answer it, I just want to say that we were both at a relatively early demonstration, the Saturday night demonstrations.
Just 200,000 people at that one.
In Tel Aviv, yeah, that have now continued for 15 weeks, including after Netanyahu's pause, when he said, I'm not going to push forward the legislation, which was a tactical move designed, at least in part, to put an end or to still the momentum of this protest movement. It's been extraordinary to see who does come out. We'll get to who doesn't come out in a second. Older people, younger people, multi-generational, Israelis from all sorts of walks of life in the obvious places, North Tel Aviv, and the less obvious places like Beersheba and Efrat. One really feels people power in the ways that other revolutions, bottom-up revolutions, have generated. So when we were there, I think we felt both a tremendous sense of energy. And it's so interesting how it plays out within the demonstration. So
you described it. You turned to me and you said, "This feels like inspired outrage."
Yeah,
which I thought really captured that feeling.
The outrage came a couple days later after the pogrom in the Palestinian town of Hawara, but at the demonstration itself,
So there's the main stage, and we never made it to the main stage because there are so many corners at which there are different groups of activists, scores or hundreds, chanting, calling for democracy and equality in the most inspiring ways. So one senses the remarkable diversity within the unity of the protest movement. And I should say that here in Los Angeles, there's a demonstration every Sunday at 11 o'clock, and they're grappling with the problem of how to manage diversity within unity. Should the message be only, let's put an end to Netanyahu's planned judicial reform / coup, or is it also possible to talk about the occupation as a major roadblock to the realization of any meaningful notion of democracy? And that's being played out, and it's a constant negotiation. It seems to me that the odds are very low that the protest movement will be able to affect substantial change, but they're higher than at any other time that I can remember.
When you say that, do you mean vis-a-vis the judicial coup itself, or do you mean vis-a-vis the other issues that we are talking about?
So, there are various ways to measure success, and let's just be clear. My friend Sokach and I come from a political perspective. It doesn't represent the wide spectrum of views in Israel. But from our perspective, and Daniel can certainly speak to his view of it, so success could be defined in at least three ways. One, an end to the attempted judicial reforms, where the effort to basically defang the Supreme Court and to politicize completely the process of appointing judges and legal advisors and ministries will disappear. Two, and there are various forms of this, either a new election or some brokered deal by which Benjamin Netanyahu disappears. Is induced to leave the stage in exchange, as has been put forward, for a decision to drop the charges against it, a way of sort of averting a major constitutional crisis, an even deeper one. And that might well mean the return to government of people like Yair Lapid and Benny Gantz, who was defense minister in some of the earlier governments. Lapid was prime minister in that short-lived government that was known as the government of change between 2021 and 2022 that displaced Netanyahu and Likud.
He was prime minister for like a couple of months of that one.
And he was only part of the rotation agreement. So that could be seen as success. But there's a third measure of success, and that is a bit more transformational. That is really harnessing the full power of the people and not just the Jewish population. It could take very concrete form, like a basic law on equality, right? A basic law that enshrines the principle of equality. It could take the form of an agreement, quite in contrast to current Israeli practice, to guarantee that any future governing coalition must have an Arab party, in contrast to the norm throughout the long history of coalition building in Israel, when you could not have an Arab party as part of the governing coalition. Or it could even move beyond to imagine the extension of equality to all under Israeli control, which is to say within the Green Line and beyond. So that's sort of a very, very ambitious vision for a protest movement. But those are three measures of success, and it's highly unlikely that, in my view, that we'll get to three, and maybe we'll achieve the first.
Well, this is perfect timing because I think it's time to open this up, and this is a great way. So you gave your sort of way forward. I'll do mine. It's a slightly, I don't disagree with the word you said, but I'll take a slightly different approach to those issues. I'll have three as well, right? So markers of success. The first one would be the success in stopping the judicial coup. And that's where, as I said at the beginning of our time together, I'm not more sanguine than you. I'm more sanguine than I am about other aspects of what I would count as successes, which is to say that's by no means guaranteed that the protesters in Israel will succeed. This fight is not over. But if I were betting, I would bet on them. Because not only, I mean, polls are nothing more than snapshots in time. Let's stipulate that. But have you seen the polls over the last few weeks from Israel? Channel 12 came out with a poll a couple of days ago, right before Shabbat. And I believe the spread between what the opposition, the current opposition and the current coalition, they flip positions, and it's by it's something like 10 to 11 seats. So that, in Israeli terms, as David said, were elections held today. The recent polling suggests what would be considered a landslide by the opposition. Benjamin Netanyahu's personal credibility has plummeted, and the Likud and the right-wing parties are showing much diminished returns if elections were held today. And I think that's because of everything that we spent the last hour discussing. And I think that we should be inspired and animated by the fact that, in the words of another one of our board members, a professor, a young Israeli, who can be pretty fatalistic and cynical sometimes, who said to us, well, at this rally, at this demonstration, she said, well, it turns out we ain't Poland and we ain't Hungary, right? We're not letting our democracy go quietly. So I would bet on them, especially with the United States and the world and Moody's and the reservists and the tech all on their side. And Moody's. Yeah, Moody's is a big deal.
And high tech.
Big deal. The second dimension is a good journalist. If you don't read him, you should. By the way, I'm going to put a plug in for Haaretz newspaper. You got to pay money to get past the paywall, but it really is good reportage coming from Israel. And analysis. And one of the journalists he quite literally wrote the book on Benjamin Netanyahu is a guy called Anshel Pfeffer. And he wrote a few weeks ago that one way of looking at what's happening in Israel is finally the secular. Remember, secular has a somewhat different meaning in Chiloni, and in Hebrew is a little different from secular here. He says, this is finally the Chiloni revolution. Finally, you can understand this movement that the hundreds of thousands of Israelis who serve in the army, who pay their taxes, who play by the rules, they're saying we are tired of subsidizing the ultra-Orthodox community that doesn't do those things. And he postulates, in some senses, they're even saying, and we're tired of seeing the settlement enterprise be underwritten by successive governments instead of, right, the Israeli public within the Green Line. So I'm less sanguine that we will see that realized, but I still think that's interesting, and there might be a moment where Israelis, when it especially comes to the relationship between the Haredi community and its power and its contribution and lack thereof, and the rest of the population, there may be something that is changing. But the third thing, which is what he touched on in that sort of second bit, is that this will turn into a recognition that one of the engines of the evisceration of Israeli democracy has been the settlement enterprise and its leaders in Smotrich and Ben Gvir, but also Rothman and Levin, the Likud politicians, who also are pushing these reforms in no small part to pave the way towards a permanent and different relationship between Israel and the territories that it occupies. And I'm less, of the three things, that's the one I'm least sanguine about, because I think that, at the end of the day, the success that you described in the erasure of the Green Line, in the mental maps of Jewish Israelis, right, who don't see the settlements really as different from Israel anymore. They see the Palestinians who live in the West Bank as alien, but not the Jewish communities in the West Bank. And I'm less sanguine that will really be addressed. But on that depressing note, we should probably open it up, right? Andrea, you want to?
Yeah, I'm here. Too many questions. I forgot to mention that David Myers and Nomi, his wife, won the National Book Award for their book American Shtetl. So I forgot, and I apologize.
National Jewish Book Award, I would say. Yeah,
Jewish Book
narrow
Award.
To narrow the focus somewhat.
Sorry.
My book, by the way, was a finalist for that same National Book Award, which was the National Jewish Book Award.
Okay, so I'm going to start with questions. Please, we use these mics. So is Israel the only democracy in the Middle East, or is that nonsense? Because you described something that is quite not the case. Am I wrong? Is Israel not the only democracy in the Middle East?
I'll just quickly say, for many, many years, a number of democracy rating institutions are out there. One of them is the Economist magazine, and there's Freedom House. There are a number of affiliated organizations that spend a lot of time creating criteria and really describing the quality of democracy or the lack thereof in the world. For at least a decade and a half, Israel has been, so the categories are full democracy, flawed democracy, partial democracy, and autocracy. And Israel has been in the second category of flawed democracy for many, many years. But you know who else has been in that category for many, many years? Yeah. So I guess the point I'm making here, like Scandinavia, Ireland, good old Costa Rica, right? Those are full democracies according to these ratings. But I guess I would argue that these things are not there's a bit of a false dichotomy, because there isn't really democracy or not a democracy. There is, as these ratings suggest, a spectrum. And Israel on the spectrum has always been, or for many, many years, has been, like our own country, something of a flawed democracy. There's wags will say that from the birth of the state in May 1948 until a point in 1966, Israel governed large swaths of the territory of the state of Israel. Large swaths were governed by a military governor. They were geographic areas, the triangle, as it's known, in the north center of the country, the Upper Galil, parts of the Negev. Why? Because those were regions where the majority of the population were Arabs. And so they had a different governance system. There were curfews, there were restrictions on freedom of movement and freedom of expression. And in 1966, those were all taken away. And Israel really was, for all of its citizens, at least on paper, a full democracy. And in June 1967, Israel has this stunning victory in the Six-Day War, conquers all this territory, and inherits a situation where they control millions and millions of people, many of whom they still control. So some will say Israel was a full democracy for less than a year. But what it means to be a democracy is not necessarily a yes or no answer.
Okay, fair enough. Let's go to...
Yeah, I'd like to fact check two things with you. By the way, Netanyahu was on Meet the Press this morning, and he is quite an accomplished spin master. Anyway, the one thing is there was some discussion that Ben-Gvir wanted the pause so that he could amass a separate militia to confront the protesters. That was one. The second was in the New York Times this morning that suggests that after the judicial coup, Netanyahu is going after the independent press. So, any of that true?
Yeah, thank you. This is what the nature of navigating a coalition like this is like for Netanyahu. On February 27th, he entered into an agreement with his Minister of National Security, which said, in exchange for your agreement to go along with the government in pausing the push for this judicial revolution, we will create a national militia under your control. We have the document. It's widely...
March 27th, just to keep our timeline.
March 27th, which a week later was approved by the cabinet. This is the most terrifying of propositions, because Itamar Ben-Gvir would be the direct report for thousands of people who are imbued with views similar to his. He would have the opportunity essentially to select his own personal militia, and he is someone who has called for the removal of Arabs from the state of Israel. He has called for attacks on demonstrators, on people of a political view other than his own. There is not the slightest profession of commitment to any democratic value whatsoever. He's a follower of Meir Kahane, the American-born Israeli racist rabbi, and a great admirer of Baruch Goldstein, the Brooklyn-born doctor who in 1994 massacred 29 Muslims in a mosque in Hebron. So this is an extraordinarily terrifying moment, and reveals the extent to which Netanyahu, who, as you note, is a brilliant rhetorician, is kind of spinning out of control. As a means of staying in power, he's prepared to grant Ben-Gvir a private militia. Now, one thing Israel doesn't lack for is law enforcement units, right? The army in all of the many forms it takes, the Secret Service, the Shabak, the Shin Bet, the Mossad, the Border Patrol, the police. This is simply granting Ben-Gvir reign to run roughshod over political opponents. It is that prospect, which had been surfaced as a possibility before, which led some of our Palestinian Israeli colleagues to say very explicitly to us, which prompted Daniel and me to write a piece in the LA Times. We fear a second Nakba. We believe it's now imperative to send our children abroad for school and to buy real estate elsewhere if we can, so we can make a plan for our escape. Because clearly, with these people in power, possessing the kind of power they do, holding to the views they do, it is only a matter of time until there will be a second catastrophe. Now, is this Ben-Gvir's true intention? Will he be allowed to do what he has said he wants to do? That I don't know. But I can only tell you from how does it look? And it's a very important exercise for many of us American Jews to engage in sometimes. What does it look like through Palestinian eyes? It looks like democracy. There's never really been a democracy. And now you're really planning for a second major expulsion. This is what people are thinking and saying. And it I think, was concretized in that letter that Netanyahu wrote to Ben-Gvir, in which he essentially gave him a private militia. You may want to.
Well, I just want to say that if you don't want to look through Palestinian eyes, and we continue to urge ourselves and all of us to try to do so, look through the eyes of the Israeli police and the IDF, who have said it is madness to grant Ben-Gvir the private militia that you are correctly fact-checking, or rather you are correct in the assumption of your fact-check that has been promised to him by the prime minister. In terms of the Israeli media, the press, that one I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. That's certainly not part of the coalition agreement. It has been part of the playbook of the Orbans and the Erdogans and the Putins. Obviously, has been to diminish the power of the press. There was an attempt to try to shut down the public broadcaster in Israel. It didn't succeed. Israel does have a very lively and robust press. But one thing that we haven't mentioned yet that is in the coalition agreement is an agreement to impose tremendous new restrictions on the nonprofit sector, in particular civil and human rights organizations in Israel. That is to say, Israeli human rights organizations and Israeli civil rights organizations. There is an agreement. A part of the coalition agreement would tax foreign contributions to those organizations to the tune of 65% in the initial draft. Now, Orban has a similar law. It's 40% tax. So now that has not been put forward yet. That's just but it is a draft law that's in the Knesset.
We can't hide from the fact that many of the proposals that are being put forward are drawn directly from this shared playbook that the Modis and the Erdogans and the Kaczynskis and the Putins and the Orbans have been seeking to implement in their respective countries. You can almost identify the checklist of where we're going, and the attack on the judiciary is a central part of that overall blueprint. And what scholars of fascism would say is one of the most important early warning signs.
And I know we have questions. I'll just quickly add that one of the things that gives me hope
right? You know, had you asked me 4 months ago, is the Israeli population going to rise up in this mass protest? You know, we're pretty tuned in, and I would have said it wouldn't surprise me. But what did surprise me, you know, was that it rose up in the numbers it did, and it's lasted this long. And that gives me hope about the other pieces that you mentioned in particular, right? One of the things that animated the protests, David mentioned, you know, tens of thousands of Israelis are still coming out even after the pause. And one of the things they're talking about is Ben Gvir's private army. And I, perhaps naively, think that it is much more likely that the Israeli public that is on the streets will understand that a private army, attack on the judiciary, crackdown on civil rights organizations, crackdown on the media, it's all of a piece. It's all from the same playbook. And I'm much more optimistic now that those issues are things that will bring Israelis into the streets, as well as the attack on the courts.
So you mentioned as one of the factors that may have sort of checked Netanyahu as being Biden's comments. And yet, sorry, when Biden did comment, Netanyahu kind of said, "Butt out, we'll be running our own country." So I'm wondering what else you think the US government should be doing, or what you would like to see them do.
Well, I'll just say that whatever Mr. Netanyahu and his coalition, by the way, Ben Gvir's response to that was, "We are not another star on the American flag." And, you know, I would take the response from Israeli leaders to the I don't want to call it unprecedented, but in recent decades, unprecedented kind of sharp rebuke from the United States. I would take their protestations that they don't really care about that, not with a grain of salt, but with a Passover-sized saltwater dish of salt. They absolutely care about what the U.S. is saying. And in fact, right, that is clearly an ingredient in them pausing. So in terms of what I think the United States should do, I wrote a piece about this a year or so ago before the judicial coup, in which I argued that President Biden would be we don't do anyone any favors in Israel when we don't ask that Israel be accountable for what it does with U.S. aid and with the U.S. friendship that we extend to it, and that we should really try to operationalize, in political terms, the principle of friends don't let friends drive drunk, and that we should say, look, you guys, Joe Biden, he loves Israel, maybe not like he loves Ireland, but he loves Israel. He feels this visceral connection to the place that a coming generation of American Democratic politicians do not feel, right? And right now, the opportunity, the potential for them to feel it is being eroded by the day. And, you know, I think that one of the things I think it would be important for the U.S. to signal to Israel is that not only is this unacceptable for us now, but American Jews overwhelmingly vote Democratic and have done every year since the records were kept, except for when Eugene V. Debs in the 20s ran in 1920, ran as a socialist and split, right, the Jewish vote between the Democrat and the socialist, giving a plurality of the Jewish vote to the Republican. Other than that, Jews vote Democratic, and, you know, to the chagrin of the Republican Jewish coalition or whatever they're called, despite their promise every cycle that this is the year, it doesn't happen. And it doesn't happen because of American Jewish values, the majority of American Jews. And the argument that Joe Biden used, I don't know if you noticed this, but on that abrupt tarmac rebuke of Netanyahu that he made last week, a week and a half ago, he said, not only am I not inviting him right now, he said, you know, they can't continue in this way. This is against the way of the United States, and it's against the way of the American Jewish community, he said.
So I want to just translate Daniel's somewhat lengthy answer into a single sentence. I think it's about conditioning aid. It's really using the leverage of the United States to the tune of $4 billion to assure that Israel not engage in activities that, in all of the existing agreements that are signed with it, it should not be engaging in. And we have very significant leverage. To be a political realist about it, it's highly unlikely that a first-term U.S. president would ever invoke that lever into the calculus. So if it were to come about, it would come about in a second term. It seems very harsh by the norms of American Jewish politics, as Daniel suggested with his drunk driver analogy. It seems to me to be one of the most effective tools in the toolkit intended to save Israeli
And we've done it
democracy.
before.
And we've done it before. This is about saving Israeli democracy. This is not about a punitive gesture, a thrust in the face of an enemy. And I think it's now time to really consider deploying it.
We have two more questions.
Threw out an argument that's being made that the whole muzzling the judiciary or being able to override the judiciary is democratic because it's primarily Ashkenazic and it would be helping the Sephardim. Do you guys have any response to either of these?
Yeah, I'll address the first and maybe the second briefly. So there were interesting debates in 1948. In the first months of 1948, after the United Nations General Assembly voted to approve Resolution 181, which was the plan to partition Palestine into a Jewish and Arab state, in the wake of which armed hostilities broke out. So this is a very tense and intense time. And yet in those frenzied days in January, February, through May, up to the announcement of the declaration, the proclamation of the Declaration of Independence in the afternoon of May 14th, 1948, there were drafts flying back and forth over two documents, a Declaration of Independence and a proposed constitution. And in many of those drafts, the word democracy was included, the phrase Jewish and democratic was included. Ultimately, Ben-Gurion decided to exclude the word, and that may well be because he felt that what was most important at that time, and in this regard, I think he was thinking in unfortunately short-term ways, what was most urgent was uniting the disparate Zionist factions into a single state. So the ethos was toward centralization into a single state, a process that actually assumed the form of a political doctrine known as mamlachtiyut, which we perhaps best translate as statism. This was Ben-Gurion's vision. We need to unite these disparate and competing factions into the state, and the imperative of the day was to overcome all petty party differences. My sense is that he regarded that as antithetical or perhaps injurious, antithetical to the idea of democracy, which could be injurious to that goal of achieving a kind of state of unity, the likes of which the Zionist movement had not achieved prior to this point. With respect to your question about Mizrahim, Mizrahi Jews, and the Supreme Court, I mean, I'd be curious to know if Dennis Ross actually advocated the judicial reforms, so-called reforms.
No, he just threw that out.
He raised it as a possibility.
If you're going to have an argument, democratic versus non-democratic, the argument on the Ben Gvir side is, oh, this is democratic.
Yeah, that's the argument that we hear, that the Supreme Court is an elitist institution of white Ashkenazi men, for the most part, and some women. And there is a very palpable degree of frustration and resentment on the part of non-Ashkenazi Jews. We've mentioned a lot Israel's Palestinian or Arab population. There's a very deep reservoir of resentment on the part of Mizrahi Jews, of Jews from Middle Eastern countries, towards the Ashkenazi establishment. And I would say that has to be really understood, and efforts at conversation and dialogue have to ensue, but not through the kind of dramatic structural overhaul that this proposal seeks to take, because it would essentially, what it would essentially do is eliminate the judiciary as a check in a carefully calibrated political system. And in Israel, it's not really that we have three branches of government. We really have two or two and a half, because the parliament is basically under the control of the prime minister. So the prime minister is the leader of the coalition which controls the parliament, which basically makes the executive and the legislature intermingled. You get rid of the judiciary, you altogether undo the balance. It's very easy then to concentrate political power, not just in one branch, in one person, prime minister. So that really does.
Yeah, I want to say two quick things about that, because I think there's a disingenuity about what Bibi and Ben Gvir say about the court. And I'm going to draw a rough analogy to the way, and no offense to anyone here who feels differently, but the way many of us felt about what the previous administration did to Dr. Fauci. Right? The level of animus that was ratcheted up against the court bears very little in terms of reality to what the court said and did. Most of the people who have been mobilized and organized to hate the court are hating them for reasons that are almost sort of QAnon-y when you break down what they're disagreeing with. In other words, the court hasn't actually done things that most of the people who say the court has too much power object to. They've become a symbol for that. The second thing is, and I didn't read what Ambassador Ross wrote, but David sort of referenced this earlier. There's a misapprehension about what democracy is out there. And the Erdogans and the Orbans and the Ben Gvirs and the Levins and the Rothmans sort of say, what are you talking about? How can it be anti-democratic to try to put limits on an unelected body of people, as if the only thing that a democracy is built on, the only ingredient, is rule of the majority? But of course, democracies are also about preserving the rights of the minority and creating intricate series of checks and balances to ensure that the majority has its voice in ruling the country, but the minorities are protected and defended against the mob rule, as it were. And as David just reminded us, Israel doesn't have. The only real check and balance Israel has, officially, formally, is the judiciary.
That's what he said.
And so you can't really, you can't say, well, it's anti-democratic to defend that. I will just say, again, on a note of hope, turns out Israel has another check and balance that nobody accounted for, and that is Israelis.
Yeah, people power. I think we have time for one question, and we have one more question.
Okay, thank you, and thank you so much for being here, and I'll preface this. I remember the situation before the Six-Day War. I remember listening to the Six-Day War on the radio and so on, and I'm kind of wondering if the Israeli response to the existence of Arab nations is a sort of a never again will we have tanks on our borders and have rockets shot at us. So what I want to do is distill it down to 1.5 questions. The first is simply my own ignorance. How many Arabs and Israelis actually live in the area that we refer to as the West Bank? And the second question, which I think you've made a partial answer, is there a strong Israeli movement or feeling towards getting rid of all the Arabs from what is Israel?
Well, in terms of the actual technical answer to the first part of your question, there are about 3.2 million Palestinians who live in the West Bank and about 720,000 Israelis who live in that same territory. I'll let you address, the question of how many Israelis really want to get rid of all the Arabs. But I'll remind us that if you fast forward from the sort of Six-Day War memories that you just invoked to now, Israel is at peace with its most important adversary during those years, Egypt. Israeli and Egyptian soldiers have not died fighting each other for decades and decades, for over half a century. It's at peace with Jordan. It's at peace with Morocco, with, of all things, Sudan, with the UAE, with Bahrain. So Israel's situation in the region, interestingly, right, is far more stable and sort of safe when it comes to its Arab neighbors than it ever was before. The big threat that Israelis perceive is not actually from an Arab country at all, but of course from Iran, which is seen as its archenemy. But maybe you'll address the.
Yeah, I just want to fill out the demographic picture. So, a couple million Palestinians in Gaza, a couple million Israeli citizens of Israel who are Arab, which adds up to 7 million, which is about the number of Jewish residents between the Jordan and the Mediterranean. You have relative demographic parity. And there are competing demographic visions of where things are heading. Most demographers tend to think that the balance will tip in favor of the Palestinian side over the next quarter century or so. I want to just reiterate a point Daniel said, because it's very important for our understanding of the conflict or the nature of relations between Jews and Arabs in that country. I periodized the conflict or the history of the area in these ways. So between the advent of the Zionist movement in the early 1880s and 1948, the primary conflict was between Jews and Arabs. After the creation of the State of Israel, until either 1967, but surely most decisively 1978-79, the conflict was between Israel and surrounding Arab states. That conflict, as Daniel said, basically came to an end with the first Camp David agreement, when Israel arrived at a peace agreement with Egypt, which has remarkably largely held. Because without Egypt, it was absolutely impossible to imagine a significant Arab counterweight to Israel. At that point, the conflict, in some sense, returned to a more local level and became a conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, or Israeli Jews and Palestinians. And I think we're still in that space. There are various surveys that have been taken over the last decade or so on the question you asked. Do Israeli Jews favor the removal of Arabs from the country? And disturbingly, the numbers are moving in the wrong direction. I think it was a Pew survey from 2016, something like 40% of Israelis said they would be okay with the removal of Palestinians, and I think the number was higher amongst younger Israeli Jews. The trend lines are quite disturbing in this regard, and they're, as I said, particularly disturbing because young people are more ethno-nationalist and less tolerant, certainly on the Jewish side, and to a certain extent on the Arab side, than their parents. What does this condemn us to a future of violence and bloodshed? Not necessarily. I'm a big believer, as my wife knows, because I say it ad nauseum, in the radical contingency of history. Things can change, but they need to change through concerted action and education and ongoing support of people who really care about that extraordinary, precious place. And especially in the face of the really remarkable manifestation of people power that we're seeing, I think it behooves everybody who really cares to do all they can to support that movement, which has been so marked by nonviolence, by goodwill, and by the principles of democracy and equality that I think many of us hold very dear. So,
Amen.
Yeah.
With that, thank you very much.
Thank you. And copies of the Jewish Book Award winner, American Shtetl, and the almost Jewish Book Award winner. Can we talk about Israel? They're for sale in the lobby, and maybe the guys will sign them if we ask nicely. So thank you so much. This was such a fun program.